The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
My name's Christine Jackson, and I'm a member of the Historical Society of Ottawa. I edit for them their Bytown series of pamphlets, which gives me an awful lot of history of the Ottawa area. I'm also a member of the British Isles Family History Society of Greater Ottawa, and in fact I'm very much a family historian. I've actually been doing that sort of thing for over 40 years. But most of my family, of course, or all of my family, are back in Britain. So this work that I do with the Historical Society is really an opportunity to learn an awful lot about Ottawa and the region.
Christine's activities with these two esteemed heritage societies have given Christine the welcome opportunity to delve into the history of Ottawa and the region, where Christine, a longtime family historian, has lived since the 1970s. Have you ever wondered how your street got its name? Christine did. She had lived on Cowley Avenue for more than 30 years. When she found out it was a Cowley, Robert Henry Cowley, who had long ago also laid out the original subdivision that is now her neighborhood of Champlain Park, this discovery launched Christine on a 3-year-long journey of research. It began when someone in the neighborhood said they knew of a descendant of the Cowley family who was living up in Pontiac County in Quebec, and that they had her phone number. Christine describes plucking up the courage to call this Cowley descendant and explain that she wanted to research the Cowley family. As it turns out, this Cowley descendant, Jane Cowley Egan, was very happy to hear about Christine's project and invited Christine to come visit her in her home in Norway Bay.
My aim at that point was to trace the Cowley family back.
Of particular interest to Christine were pages of handwritten notes by a family member in 1904, Mary Agnes Cowley, who had traced the family back to 1697 in England. The family had saved Mary's notes. Christine discovered that a book about Robert Henry Cowley had also been written in 1935 by a friend, which again detailed much of the family's history, again making use of Mary's notes. So Christine had these two wonderful types of documents, which not every family is fortunate to possess. From these papers, the family knew that the family patriarch had come over in the 19th century from England and had made quite an impression here. Through Christine's own additional extensive research through online genealogical sources and in visits to record offices over in England, Christine was able to piece together a detailed family tree going back to the 1500s. Christine's focus for today's presentation begins with the family that arrived in 1831 from England, consisting of a mother, father, and 2 children. The father, Miles Cowley, was 65. And unlike other family members, had not been very successful in business and had actually gone bankrupt and had probably been supported by the family.
I suspect he was kept by the family, but what made him actually leave at the age of 65 and go to the wilderness of Lower Canada, I don't know.
Miles Cowley had married at the age of 50 to a woman from a neighboring parish who was 12 years younger than him and still young enough to have children, 2 of whom survived and accompanied their parents to Canada. Miles had been working as a gardener. In addition to his family, he brought with him a puncheon or barrel of china goods, which his younger brother, a successful china merchant, had provided for Miles to sell as a financial start in Canada. Miles settled on a piece of land in what is now downtown Montreal. Today, this piece of land is occupied by Mary, Queen of the World Cathedral on Rennes Boulevard. Miles dug a garden and was presumably able to grow some food that summer. But then, the following spring, he died of a fever. His son Daniel, now 14, and his daughter, just 8. Tragically, their mother then died too, the following year, in 1832.
So he went to work. He went to work as a grocer's apprentice, and he learned bookkeeping while he was there. And then he got his first exposure to riverboating. He got some sort of a job on a riverboat that was plying the St. Lawrence, the lower St. Lawrence. But something made him move to Ottawa, which of course at that time was called Bytown.
So this young man, Daniel Keysworth Cowley, went to work as a grocer's apprentice where he learned bookkeeping. Daniel got his first exposure to river transport, getting a job on a riverboat that was plying the lower St. Lawrence. Daniel arrived in Bytown in 1836, having been offered the job of bookkeeper on the Rideau Canal, but decided not to take the job. Bytown at the time embroiled in the violence of the Shiners' Wars between Irish and French Canadians. Christine suspects that Daniel had heard the news that up at Arnprior, the first paddle steamer had been built to ply the waters of Chat's Lakes, a 20-mile section of the Ottawa River entangled at each end by waterfalls and rapids.
And at that point, water transport was the only way of moving goods and people up and down the Ottawa Valley. So the George Buchanan was the name of this vessel, which was, as I say, the first steamboat on Chat's Lake, launched in the spring of 1836. But it was built apparently as a seagoing vessel, 95 feet long. It was a wooden vessel, which was fired by wood fire. I mean, a wooden ship. These were dangerous times if you had a wooden steamboat on the river. Lots of fires took place and boats were ruined. The George Buchanan apparently had a figurehead, it had a bowsprit, and it had a rounded stern with 5 windows, which would have had a wonderful view out over the river and the lake for the passengers who were traveling up and down the lake. This boy, by the name of Daniel Keysworth Cowley, got a job as an assistant purser on the George Buchanan, and he must have had, I think, a very special character. I became very fond of him during my research and referred to him all the time as Captain Dan, which I will do now. And by the age of 21, he was actually appointed the master of the George Buchanan. And this was a ship that he guided up and down Chat's Lake for a number of years through the 1840s. He actually bought the ship with a partner in 1842, and they had a monopoly on what was called the forwarding business. And forwarding referred to forwarding goods and forwarding people, of course, up and down the river. He seemed to have been based in Sandpoint, which today is a very small place, just a few miles from Arnprior, where they actually used to build ships as well. It's hard traveling through this area today, even through Arnprior, to imagine that these were shipbuilding docks, in effect. What happened after a while is somehow Captain Dan met a young woman from across the river. She was a Scottish immigrant. They married in 1844 in Sandpoint, and which is interesting. She was a strict Scottish Presbyterian, and Captain Dan was an Anglican, as far as I can tell. They married in an Anglican church in Sandpoint, 1844, by a minister with the wonderful name of Hannibal Mulkins. And he was a minister who was probably the only available minister to marry people in 9 townships, mostly on what is now the Ontario side of the river, and also the 2 townships across the river, which I've mentioned, Bristol and Norway Bay, in Bristol Township and Clarendon Township. So Captain Dan at that point bought an existing farm in Clarendon Township, just across the river. It was a log home that was already constructed, and the farm was already on the go. He continued to farm it, and he also continued with his forwarding business. The farm that he had, the log house, was only about 150 feet from the shore of the Ottawa River. Of course, with what's happened because of the damming of the river over the centuries, I think the level of the river has changed somewhat. And one of his sons, who inherited the house, actually moved it further up the bank of the river, away from the river. So I can guess that there may have been some flooding issues, I don't know, in the early days. So we're in the 1840s, and towards the latter 1846, finally Captain Dan had some competition on the Chats Lake monopoly that he'd previously had, and a company was formed, the Union Forwarding Company, and they built what has become known as the first railway in the Ottawa Valley. In fact, it was a horse railway, no engines involved at all. Quite an incredible thing at that. It must have been terrifying to travel on it, I think. It traveled on trestles over swampy land. This was all in order to avoid the Chats Falls, which were really powerful series of falls, which are now, of course, dammed up for power generation. But they are located just by Fitzroy Harbour, and there's on the what's now the Ontario side, there's a series of islands originally, and the most southerly island, which is opposite Fitzroy Harbour, is called Victoria Island. And this was an island on one side. On the east side of the island, steamboats from Lac des Chênes, which was the lake in the Ottawa River just to the east of Chats Falls, going down to Aylmer. The steamboats there would land on the east side of Victoria Island. The passengers and the cargo would have to be carried or walk across Victoria Island to the west side, where they would pick up a steamboat on the west side, and this avoided the actual falls. So it was a very uncomfortable trip, and that's actually the route that Captain Dan used in order to get people onto the George Buchanan and his ships on Chats Lake. But the horse railway went around the north side of Chats Falls, between Pontiac and Union Village, and it's quite remarkable. It was drawn by two horses, and the carriageway was wider than the rails were, and it was up high above a swamp which was infested with mosquitoes, and this was several miles long. It must have been either exciting or terrifying, I think, because one of Queen Victoria's sons, the Duke of Connaught, twice used the horse railway on his trips up here. What happened in the 1860s was that the railways arrived, made its way up to Sandpoint by 1865, and of course then it was continued on up the valley to Mattawa and places west eventually going through to Lake Huron and the Great Lakes and the rest of Canada. This really was the beginning of the end of the water transport forwarding business on the Ottawa River in this particular location. But it kept going. It kept going for some time. There were mergers. The companies, Captain Cowley's company merged with the company that was running the horse railway, and they were able to keep going until 1879, when they finally went out of business because the railways had taken over and there was no more business for them. During that time, Captain Cowley, Captain Dan as I call him, had partnered with Jason Gould, who was a very famous businessman in the upper Ottawa Valley, and he wanted to get more ships on the river further up in the Ottawa Valley. And however, between Portage du Fort and Pembroke, there are masses of rapids, and it was just impossible, and everybody had to portage around them. And so there's a portage route which is now called the Champlain Trail, which the indigenous people had used even before Champlain actually went up the Ottawa River. They probably showed him the portage. And so Jason Gould, from a place called Gould's Landing on the Ottawa River, near what they call the Snows Rapids, it was one of what they call the corduroy roads, which were basically logs laid down side by side, making for extremely bumpy ride. It was 13 miles of corduroy road to Cobden, and then at Cobden there's a lake now called Muskrat Lake, and it was navigable in those days, and at the end of the lake there's a creek called Muskrat Creek, which went into the boundary or the outer edge of the town of Pembroke. So this meant that people were able, and cargoes were able to be transported along this corduroy road to Cobden, where they would be transferred onto initially barges, but later on steamboats. Apparently the lake was very shallow, and the creek itself that went into Pembroke was very, very shallow, so that the crew used to have to stand on deck and pole the ship, even though these were actually steamboats. So this was a route that Captain Dan managed and ran boats on for some years, as well as on Chats Lake on the Ottawa River. And there's an account of a terrible fire in 1853 which swept across Renfrew County, but had come in across from what is now the Quebec side, across Île aux Allumettes. It had come in, I think I read that it had been started because farmers were burning land off for agricultural purposes, and it got out of control and swept into Pembroke. And a paddle steamer had just arrived that morning from further upriver, and there was a paddle steamer waiting on the south side of Pembroke to go onto the Muskrat route, but there was fire throughout the town, and there was a terrible job getting people transferred and cargoes between the two ships, but they made it. But then Captain Dan and his crew had to literally fight their way down the Muskrat Creek and Lake to Cobden through what's referred to as a canopy of fire. He had the passengers bailing the decks of this wooden ship with water from the creek, and also bailing himself and his navigator, who had to stay on deck. He must have had an immense amount of bravery and leadership and resourcefulness. When the ice floes came across, were blown across the river onto the George Buchanan, they crushed the ship and it sank. And in February, Captain Dan set off on foot across the ice down to Aylmer to get help from another ship's captain who was experienced in restoring and repairing boats. So this man, I think, was, had an incredible character, and his workers apparently loved him. When he died in 1897 at the age of 81, he died of an aortic aneurysm. His obituary in the newspaper was amazing and really emphasized how much his workers loved him, and after he retired, how they would love him dropping by just to see how they were getting on and tell stories. He was a great storyteller. Unfortunately, his daughter, who wrote those notes that I referred to in 1904, didn't include the many stories that apparently he told. But his son, Males, he carried on the family name, that was his second son. His first son died fairly young. But Males is the only one of his 12 children who survived and continued to live in the Ottawa Valley. But Males is the one, he also became for a while a steamboat captain, and he would, even though there wasn't a whole lot of business, he did some passenger, transfer of passengers on Chats Lake. He continued to live in Bristol. He was politically, he was very liberal with a capital L. He was constantly writing to the newspapers. Everybody knew him. He would be reported when he visited Ottawa. It would get in the local papers that Captain Males had visited Ottawa on such and such a date. And in 1926, the Ottawa Citizen actually carried a whole series of stories of Captain Males, Cowley, because he was a tremendous storyteller. Some of the stories that circulated in the family were, I think, a little bit, what one might say, elaborated a little bit on reality. But many of the stories, of course, were of the old days in the 1800s in the Ottawa Valley. Now, Captain Males did, in the end of his life, he lived in Ottawa. He moved in with his wife, and 3 of those children, I think, are notable for very different reasons. One of them joined the Air Force in the Second World War and was assigned to Bomber Command in the British, the Royal Air Force in Britain, and was sadly lost. He was a pilot, a co-pilot, and a navigator, and the plane was lost somewhere between Libya and Britain, and nobody knows where the plane went down. And of course, there are no bodies. There were no bodies found. He's commemorated on a memorial at Runnymede in Surrey, in England. His name is there. The second one I'll point out, another son, Frank, became, from what I can tell, a beloved doctor, general practitioner, and coroner for Pontiac County. He continued to live. He lived in Shawville and had a practice there, and practiced for, I think, over 35 years. Very much loved by the community. He met his wife during the war. He didn't go abroad, but he was a doctor in a hospital just outside of Montreal, and met his wife there, who was a nurse. His son and daughter still live close by, up the valley from here. But the third child of Captain Mayles, I'd like to point out, was perhaps the one who would have surprised his grandfather the most, Wild Bill Cowley, who was an award-winning center in the National Hockey League in the 1930s and 1940s. He played with the Boston Bruins and led the league in assists in 1939, 41, and 43. He helped the team to 2 Stanley Cups in 39 and 41, and was twice awarded the Hart Trophy as the MVP in the National Hockey League in 41 and 43. He had to retire in 47 due to injuries, but he maintained an interest in the Ottawa area. He was one of the co-founders of the Ottawa 67's junior hockey team, and he also owned a hotel in Smith Falls and another one in Hintonburg, which some people might remember as the Elmdale Tavern. It's now a restaurant.
In the end, Christine learned that Robert Henry Cowley, the land developer after whom Christine's street was named, was a son of Captain Dan and great uncle to Cowboy Wild Bill of the NHL, to Frank, who became the beloved doctor, and to his namesake, also named Robert Henry Cowley, the airman who gave his life in World War II. It was Captain Dan who in 1867 had purchased a house on Nepean Township's Richmond Road, along with 200 acres of farmland, bounded on the north by the CPR tracks, what is now Scott Street and the O.C. Trampo Transitway, and Carling Avenue to the south. It was land adjacent to his father's homestead and the Ottawa River that Robert Henry Cowley later acquired, upon which in 1904 he laid out the beginnings of the subdivision in which Christine lives today. Beyond his adventures in land development, Robert Henry Cowley also left a legacy as a renowned educator. To learn more, visit the Historical Society of Ottawa website and search the Cowley family, and you'll find much more that Christine has written about this important Ottawa Valley family.